At my husband's funeral, my daughter-in-law glared at me and said, "Don't think you're moving in with us. You're not wanted." She said it in front of everyone, while my son just stood there, torn. I stayed silent, only handing him a letter I had written. But when he read it, the entire house shook with his choice. "I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." The taxi slowed in front of the red brick house nestled in the quiet suburbs of Boston. Margaret Collins leaned back against the worn leather seat, her hands resting on the handle of her suitcase. The driver gave her a polite nod in the rearview mirror before pulling over to the curb. With a sigh, she handed him the fare, thanked him, and stepped out onto the sidewalk, the late afternoon sun catching the silver in her neatly pinned hair. The trip back from Chicago had been long, but Margaret's heart carried a rare sense of pride. At the education conference, she had stood beneath the bright stage lights, holding the Academic Excellence Award in her trembling hands. 40 years of teaching English literature had culminated in that moment. Every late night spent grading essays, every lecture carefully prepared, every sacrifice she had made, all of it felt recognized, validated. As she adjusted her blazer, smoothing the lapel with a careful hand, she imagined the look on her grandchildren's faces when she told them. Emma was 10 now, curious and sharp-eyed, always asking questions that made Margaret smile. Liam, only 8, had inherited his father's mischievous grin. They might not fully understand the meaning of the award, but she hoped they would see it as proof that dedication mattered, that love and hard work bore fruit. She wanted them to feel proud of her, not just as grandma, but as Margaret, the woman who had given her best to the world. The driver set her suitcase on the curb and tipped his cap. "Have a good day, Professor," he said warmly. Margaret smiled, touched. "Thank you, I will." As the cab pulled away, she stood still for a moment, staring at the house. The curtains were drawn back, lights glowing inside. It was Sunday, and she had told Michael she would stop by after the conference. She pictured Sophie in the kitchen, maybe preparing dinner, the children playing upstairs. A small shiver of anticipation ran through her. She had missed them dearly during the week away. Carrying her suitcase up the path, she paused at the door and knocked gently, though she had a key. Old habits of courtesy never left her. Michael opened the door, tall and broad-shouldered, with the familiar weary expression of a man juggling work and family. "Mom," he said with a half-smile, stepping aside. "Hello, Michael," she answered softly, her heart tugging at the sight of her son. She stepped inside, inhaling the scent of roasted chicken and herbs. The house felt warm, filled with laughter and distant chatter. Yet beneath that warmth lingered something she could not name. An unease, a subtle distance she felt the moment she crossed the threshold. Sophie appeared from the kitchen, her blonde hair pulled back neatly, her smile polite but strained. "Margaret, welcome back. The trip went well?" "It did," Margaret replied, careful to keep her tone pleasant. "It was exhausting, but rewarding." Sophie nodded without enthusiasm. "That's good to hear." Margaret swallowed the pinch of disappointment. She longed for genuine warmth, but Sophie rarely offered more than civility. Still, she set her suitcase by the stairs and forced a bright smile. "I brought something to show you all, the children especially." At the mention of Emma and Liam, Sophie's lips tightened ever so slightly. She turned toward the living room. "They're upstairs. They'll come down later." Michael cleared his throat and gestured for Margaret to sit. "Let me get you some tea." Left alone for a moment, Margaret's eyes wandered. On the side table lay a thick family album, its cover worn but familiar. She had spent years filling pages of albums like that, recording birthdays, Christmas mornings, and lazy summer afternoons at the lake. Curiosity drew her closer. She lifted the album carefully and opened it. The first pages brought smiles. Emma in her school uniform, Liam holding a baseball bat, Sophie posing beside Michael at a dinner party. But as Margaret turned more pages, her smile faltered. A sick chill slid down her spine. In photo after photo, where once she had stood proudly beside her son and grandchildren, she was gone. Cropped out, erased. The empty space where her figure had been was glaring, deliberate. Margaret's fingers trembled as she turned another page, and then she froze. Across one glossy photograph written in bold black ink were the words, "Worst grandma in the world." The room seemed to tilt. Her chest tightened, breath catching as if the air had been stolen away. She clutched the album, staring in disbelief at the cruel letters that mocked her. Her knees felt weak, her throat raw, but she could not speak. The warmth of the house, the laughter in the distance, all of it dissolved into a cruel, echoing silence. Margaret closed the album slowly, her hands trembling, pressing it to her lap as if it might burn on her. In that moment, the recognition she had carried home from Chicago, the pride, the glow, the sense of worth, crumbled like fragile glass. All she felt was the hollow weight of betrayal. Her eyes lifted toward the staircase where faint footsteps approached. She thought of Emma's smile, of Liam's small hand in hers, of Michael's face as a boy when he had needed her. And yet, sitting in her son's home, staring at the evidence of her erasure, she realized with piercing clarity she no longer belonged. Margaret sat rigidly on the sofa, the family album still resting against her lap. She could feel the weight of it pressing into her thighs, heavier than paper and ink had any right to be. She longed to close her eyes and will away what she had just seen, but the cruel words burned too deeply into her mind. Worst grandma in the world. It echoed louder than the laughter that drifted faintly from upstairs. Michael entered with 2 mugs of tea, his expression unreadable as he set one on the coffee table. He did not notice the album clutched in her hands. "Here you go, Mom," he said, his voice carrying the politeness of a host, not the warmth of a son. "Thank you," Margaret murmured, though her throat was too tight to sip. She watched him sit across from her, his shoulders tense, his gaze sliding past her rather than meeting it. "Where are Emma and Liam?" she asked softly. Michael rubbed the back of his neck. "Upstairs. They're busy." Her heart pricked. "I'd like to see them. I brought a few gifts, books they might enjoy." At that moment, Sophie appeared, her presence filling the room like a sharp wind. She folded her arms across her chest, leaning against the doorway. "They'll come down later. They've had enough excitement this weekend. They don't need to be distracted with more clutter." Margaret blinked, the sting of the word clutter hitting harder than she expected. "Books are hardly clutter," she said gently, trying to keep her voice calm. Sophie's smile was thin, her eyes cool. "That's not what I meant. But the children need routine. They don't need to be spoiled." Margaret's chest tightened. She remembered the nights she had rocked Michael to sleep when he was small, the afternoons spent reading fairy tales to him until her voice grew hoarse. She had never thought of those moments as spoiling. They had been acts of love, the very essence of motherhood. Michael shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "Let's not argue," Tippertit muttered, glancing at Sophie before looking away again. But Margaret felt the argument pressing in on her whether she wanted it or not. She had sacrificed everything, her youth, her health, her career ambitions, for her family. Now she sat in her son's living room, treated like an inconvenience, erased from their photographs, stripped of her place in their lives. She took a slow breath. "Michael," she said, her voice low but steady, "is there something I've done? Something that has caused all this distance?" Her son hesitated. His lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, he dropped his gaze, staring into his untouched tea. Sophie answered for him. "It isn't about one thing, it's about boundaries. You've had a habit of inserting yourself, making everything about you. It's not healthy for the children." Margaret's pulse hammered in her ears. "Inserting myself?" she repeated, her voice cracking despite her effort to stay calm. "I am their grandmother. I have loved them, cared for them." "Love them in your way," Sophie cut in, her tone sharp. "But you overshadow us. You undermine our parenting. Emma and Liam don't need another mother. They need space to grow without being smothered." The words pierced deeper than any blade could. Margaret's fingers curled tightly around the album until her knuckles whitened. She thought of the photographs, of her image cut out as though she had never existed. She realized now it was not the children who wanted her gone. It was Sophie, meticulously rewriting the story of this family with Margaret erased from every page. Michael remained silent, his silence louder than any accusation. His loyalty lay with his wife, not his mother. The boy who once clung to her hand when storms rattled the windows now looked away, leaving her to weather the tempest alone. Margaret set the album carefully on the coffee table, her hands trembling. I see, she whispered. The room thickened with silence. Sophie shifted her weight, satisfied, while Michael pretended to study the floor. The ticking of the clock on the wall filled the space where words should have been. From upstairs, faint footsteps padded across the floorboards. A child's laugh drifted down, a sound so pure it nearly undid her. Margaret's throat tightened with unshed tears. She wanted to rush upstairs, scoop her grandchildren into her arms, and remind them that she was still there. Still their grandmother. Still the woman who would do anything for them. But the invisible wall between her and the staircase stopped her cold. She rose slowly, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. Perhaps I should go, she said softly, though every fiber of her longed to stay. Michael looked up then, his expression flickering with something, guilt, hesitation, perhaps even regret, but he said nothing. Sophie only nodded, her eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. Margaret turned toward the door, her steps heavy. The warmth of the house, once so inviting, now felt like a cage that had rejected her. She had never felt so small, so unwanted, in all her years. And as she reached for her coat, a single thought seared her heart. She had given everything, yet somehow she had become the stranger in her own family. The words sliced through the quiet evening like a blade. Margaret froze halfway up the staircase, her hand gripping the polished wooden railing, as Sophie's voice floated up from the kitchen. She had only intended to slip upstairs and say goodnight to Emma and Liam, to kiss their foreheads before retreating to her room. But the sharp edge of her daughter-in-law's tone anchored her in place. She can't stay here much longer, Michael, Sophie hissed, her voice laced with impatience. It's suffocating. The children don't need her constant interference. They don't even like being around her anymore. Margaret's heart clenched. She held her breath, listening, her body trembling as though the house itself had turned against her. Michael's voice followed, lower, wearier. She just came back from the conference. Let's not start tonight. Start? Sophie's laugh was cold. This isn't starting anything. It's the truth. She makes everything about her. She parades that award like it means something to the kids. They don't care about her career. They don't care about her sacrifices. To them, she's a burden. To me, she's an anchor dragging us down. The words burned into Margaret's chest, searing deeper with each syllable. Burden, anchor. She pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting the sob rising in her throat. Every memory of sleepless nights tending to Michael's fevers, every birthday cake baked with care, every lesson taught with patience, reduced to this, a burden. Michael did not defend her. His silence thundered louder than Sophie's cruelty. The boy she had raised, the man she had supported, stood idle while his wife painted her as unwanted, irrelevant. Margaret staggered back, retreating into the shadows of the hallway. The voices continued below, weaving a web of betrayal that ensnared her with every word. She undermines me, Sophie pressed on. Every time she opens her mouth, she challenges my authority. Do you know what Emma told me last week? She said Grandma thinks she should study more books, not waste time with the things I choose for her. She's planting seeds of doubt in their heads. She's trying to turn them against me. Michael sighed heavily. You're overthinking this, Sophie. Am I a boa? Sophie snapped. Or are you just too weak to admit that your mother doesn't belong here? She had her time. She raised you, fine. But this is my family now. Our home, our rules, and she doesn't fit into it. Margaret's legs nearly gave out. She pressed herself against the wall, trembling so violently she feared they would hear her shaking. She wanted to scream, to storm down those stairs and defend herself, to shout that she had never once sought to undermine Sophie, only to love her grandchildren and guide them. But her voice would not come. Her throat was clamped tight with anguish. The faint creak of the refrigerator door, the clink of glasses, the soft thud of a cupboard closing. It all felt surreal, as if life below carried on while hers shattered in silence. Finally, Michael muttered, "We'll talk about it later." "No," Sophie said firmly. "We talk about it now. I won't keep living in a house where I feel second to her. Either she learns her place or she leaves." Margaret backed away, her pulse drumming in her ears, tears stinging her eyes. She slipped into the guest room, shutting the door quietly behind her, leaning against it as though it could shield her from the venom seeping through the walls. The room felt colder than it had minutes before. Her suitcase sat unopened at the foot of the bed, her blazer draped neatly across the chair. She stared at them, at the symbols of her independence, of her pride, and felt suddenly small, reduced, cast aside. She lowered herself onto the bed, burying her face in her trembling hands. Images of Emma's bright smile, of Liam's laughter, flickered through her mind. Did they really see her as a burden? Had Sophie twisted their hearts against her, cutting her away from them the way she had been cut from the photographs? Her chest heaved, torn between rage and despair. For decades, she had endured struggles, disappointments, long hours, and countless sacrifices. Yet she had never known betrayal like this. Not from strangers, not from colleagues, but from the very blood of her blood. Alone in the quiet, Margaret whispered into the dark, her voice trembling with defiance. "I will not let them erase me." She sat straighter, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Sophie thought she could cut her out, diminish her to nothing more than a shadow. But Margaret had endured storms far worse. She had survived poverty, the long climb through academia, the loneliness of widowhood. She would survive this too, and she would make certain that Sophie realized she had underestimated her. For now she lay back against the pillows, her mind racing, her resolve hardening. If they wanted to treat her as a burden, she would show them just how much weight she truly carried. And to everyone listening, Margaret's story is far from over. If you want to know how she rose from betrayal and reclaimed her place, stay with me. Don't forget to follow along, because what comes next will shake this family to its core. Morning light crept softly through the blinds, painting pale stripes across the guest room wall. Margaret lay awake long before the sun, her thoughts too heavy to allow rest. The muffled sounds of the household, Sophie moving about in the kitchen, Michael's hurried footsteps preparing for work, the faint laughter of Emma and Liam, reached her ears like echoes from another world. She was inside the house, yet already outside of their lives. She rose slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from her skirt and brushing her hair back into place with steady hands. Discipline had always been her armor. No matter how broken she felt inside, she would never allow the world to see her unravel. She moved quietly down the hallway, careful not to intrude, though this had once been a home where she was welcomed without hesitation. In the dining room, she paused before the mantel. Framed photographs lined the shelf, Michael in his college graduation gown, Sophie smiling beside him on their wedding day, Emma holding her first soccer trophy, Liam with frosting on his nose at his birthday party. Margaret studied each picture with a careful eye, searching for herself. But in photo after photo, she was absent, as though her presence had been erased not just from the albums, but from the very history of this family. Her chest ached. She remembered standing behind the camera for some of those moments, insisting on capturing memories. She had thought she was building a legacy for them to cherish. Instead, her love had become invisible, her place overwritten. The smell of coffee drifted into the room. Sophie's voice floated from the kitchen, cheerful and light as she spoke with the children. Margaret lingered in the doorway, listening to Emma's giggle and Liam's chatter. For a moment, her heart leapt with the old desire to join in, to slide into a chair and pour syrup over pancakes, to ask about their dreams and their plans for the day. But her feet refused to move forward. She could still hear Sophie's voice from the night before, Simon, sharp and damning. She's a burden. She doesn't belong here. Margaret retreated, the invisible wall rising higher between her and those she loved. She stepped outside instead into the cool air of the back garden. The autumn leaves carpeted the grass, golden and brittle underfoot. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around her, staring at the oak tree where Emma had once built a makeshift swing with her help. The rope still dangled there, frayed and forgotten. Her mind drifted backward, carried on the tide of memory. She saw Michael as a boy again, chasing fireflies in the dusk, his small hand clutching hers as they walked home together. She remembered the nights she had graded papers at the kitchen table while he slept nearby, determined to give him both a present mother and a successful role model. She had carried him through storms, through the loneliness of widowhood, through every challenge life hurled her way. And now the son she had poured her soul into could barely meet her eyes. Her throat tightened as she whispered into the empty yard, "Where did I go wrong?" The garden gave no answer. The only reply came from the crunch of leaves as she sank onto the bench beneath the oak. Later at dinner, she joined them at the long table. The meal was delicious. Sophie's cooking presented neatly, but every bite turned to ash in Margaret's mouth. Conversation swirled around her like a current she could not step into. Emma spoke eagerly about a school project. Liam described a game he had played with friends. Margaret smiled, nodded, but whenever she opened her mouth to add a thought, Sophie's gaze flicked toward her, sharp and warning. "So, Grandma," Sophie said suddenly, her tone sweet but cutting, "are you planning on staying long this time? I'm sure you have many important things to get back to, your books, your academic circles." Margaret set her fork down, pulse quickening. The words were disguised as polite curiosity, but the message beneath them was clear. She was not wanted here. Not truly. Michael kept his eyes on his plate. He did not defend her. He did not object. Margaret inhaled slowly, forcing calm into her voice. "I'm here because I wanted to spend time with my family. That's all." Sophie's smile was thin. "Of course, but we wouldn't want to disrupt the children's routine, you understand." The sting of dismissal cut deeper than she let show. Margaret excused herself soon after, climbing the stairs with heavy steps. From the hallway, she could hear Emma and Liam laughing with their mother. Their joy should have been her joy, yet tonight it only magnified the loneliness pressing against her chest. She closed the door to the guest room and sank into the chair by the window. Outside, the neighborhood lights glowed in warm constellations across the quiet street. Behind every window, she imagined families gathered in comfort, while she sat in silence, exiled in the midst of her own kin. Tears blurred her vision, but she brushed them away quickly. She would not let Sophie see her broken. She would not let Michael remember her as weak. No matter how sharp the isolation cut, Margaret knew she still had strength left. Somewhere deep within her, resolve flickered like a stubborn flame refusing to die. She folded her hands in her lap, whispering to herself in the dark, "They can try to erase me, but I am still here." The following afternoon unfolded with the same strained rhythm. Margaret moved about the house quietly, offering to help with small chores, but Sophie always found a way to refuse. If Margaret reached for the laundry basket, Sophie would say, "I've got it." If she stood to clear the table, Sophie would insist, "The kids can handle that." Each dismissal was coated with a smile, but the message was always the same: you are not needed. By evening, the tension in the house had grown so thick it seemed to hum in the air. Michael returned from work looking weary, loosening his tie as he stepped into the living room. The children rushed to greet him, and Sophie kissed his cheek. Margaret sat quietly in the armchair by the window, trying to blend into the wallpaper. "Mom, Michael said at last, his voice careful. "Can we talk?" Margaret's heart skipped. She nodded, rising to follow him into the study. The room smelled faintly of old leather and cedar polish, the walls lined with books she had once helped him pick out. For a fleeting second, she thought perhaps he wanted to reminisce, to share a piece of their bond. But when Michael turned to face her, his eyes carried the same guarded distance she had come to dread. "Sophie feels like things have been a little unsettled since you arrived." Margaret steadied herself. "Unsettled? Michael, I've done nothing but stay out of the way. I only wanted to be here with you, with the children." He shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not about what you've done, Mom. It's about the atmosphere. Sophie feels like it's harder to keep the routine when you're here. The kids get distracted." Her chest tightened. "So I'm a disruption now after everything?" Michael's gaze faltered. "Please don't take it that way. We're just trying to make things work for the family." The family. The word struck like a blade, as though she were somehow outside of it. Margaret swallowed hard, her voice trembling but sharp. "I am family. Or did you forget who raised you? Who stood by you when your father died? Who worked 2 jobs so you could go to college?" Michael winced. "I haven't forgotten." "Then why do I feel like a stranger in this house?" Silence hung heavy between them. For a long moment, only the ticking clock filled the space. Finally, Michael spoke, his tone low. "Mom, maybe it would be better if your visits were shorter, just a few days at a time. That way, it doesn't overwhelm anyone." The words landed like stones one after another until Margaret could scarcely breathe. Shorter visits, unwelcome presence, too much for them to bear. She straightened, gathering what remained of her dignity. If that's what you want, Michael, I won't impose any longer. His mouth opened as though he meant to soften the blow, but no words came. He simply nodded, eyes clouded with conflict, and left the room. Margaret stood alone, her hands trembling at her sides. The walls around her seemed to close in, pressing the truth into her bones. She had crossed the threshold of her son's home not as a mother to be cherished, but as an outsider tolerated only in small doses. When she returned to the living room, Sophie was waiting. That polite smile curved her lips again, triumphant in its subtlety. "Everything all right?" she asked sweetly. Margaret met her eyes, her voice firm, though her heart felt shattered. "Everything is perfectly clear." She climbed the stairs without another word. Behind the closed door of the guest room, she sank to the edge of the bed and let the tears fall, silent but unrelenting. The walls muffled the laughter drifting up from below, laughter that should have been hers to share. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Margaret sat by the window, staring into the darkness. The ache of betrayal coiled tight within her, but beneath it flickered something else, resolve. They might cut her out of albums, cut her out of dinners, cut her out of daily life, but they would not erase her story. She whispered into the night, steady and certain, "I will not disappear." Morning light spilled across the guest room, washing Margaret's face in a pale glow. She had barely slept. Her eyes were swollen from the tears she refused to let anyone hear, but her spirit carried a new weight of determination. If they wanted her gone, she would not leave quietly. Not this time. Downstairs, the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation drifted up the staircase. Margaret dressed carefully, smoothing the wrinkles from her skirt and fastening the pearl brooch she had saved for special occasions. Today, she needed its quiet strength. She carried her small leather satchel to the dining table. Sophie was already seated, scrolling through her phone while the children ate their cereal. Michael emerged from the kitchen with a steaming mug of coffee. The rhythm of their morning felt polished, practiced, as if she were watching a family portrait come to life, one where she had been erased. Margaret's hand tightened around the satchel. With deliberate calm, she pulled out a white envelope and set it on the table between the juice glasses and toast. The soft sound of paper against wood silenced the room. Sophie looked up first, her brow furrowing. "What's this?" Margaret's gaze was steady, her voice clear, though her heart pounded in her chest. "It's something I've been holding on to for years. I never thought I'd need to share it like this." Michael frowned. "Mom, what is it?" Margaret pushed the envelope toward him. "Read it." The children paused, spoons halfway to their mouths, sensing the gravity in the air. Michael slid a finger beneath the flap and drew out a folded letter. His eyes moved quickly at first, then slowed as the words sank in. By the time he reached the end, his face had drained of color. Sophie leaned closer. "What does it say?" Margaret answered before he could speak. "It's from your father. He wrote it when he was sick, before he passed. He asked me to give it to you when you were ready to understand. He wanted you to know the truth, that family is not measured in convenience or in keeping routines tidy. It's measured in loyalty, in sacrifice, in love that does not falter even when it's difficult." Michael's hands shook as he lowered the letter. His lips parted, but no words came. Margaret turned her gaze to Sophie, her tone sharpening. "And he wrote about what it meant to welcome someone into your home, not as a guest, but as kin. He believed in honor, in respect, in gratitude, qualities that seem to have gone missing here." The room was so quiet, Margaret could hear the clock ticking in the hall. Sophie shifted uncomfortably, her polished smile flickering. For once, she had no ready response. Margaret drew a breath, letting the silence stretch before she continued. "I have given my life to this family. I have sacrificed more than you'll ever know, Sophie. And yet I find myself cut out of photographs, erased from memories, treated as though I'm a burden to be managed." "Well, not anymore. Your father's words remind me who I am, and I will not let you make me invisible." Michael's eyes glistened. He looked torn, his gaze flicking between his mother and his wife. "Mom," his voice cracked, raw with conflict. Margaret lifted her chin, steady now. "I am not here to cause chaos, Michael. I am here because I love you and my grandchildren. But if my presence is something you cannot bear, then I will leave with my dignity intact, and you will live with the choice you made, knowing your father asked better of you." For a moment, no one moved. The children stared wide-eyed, sensing the fault lines splitting the family open. Sophie finally rose, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is manipulative," she snapped, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Dragging the dead into this? It's unfair." Margaret's gaze did not waver. What's unfair is pretending kindness while chiseling someone out of their own family. The letter isn't manipulation. It's truth. And truth has a way of unsettling those who fear it. Sophie's cheeks flushed crimson. She opened her mouth as if to strike back, then closed it again, her words faltering. Michael sat frozen, the letter trembling in his hands. Margaret watched him closely, her heart both breaking and daring to hope. The decision now sat in his silence, heavy as stone. Margaret stood, her chair sliding neatly back into place. "Whatever you decide, Michael, know this. I will not vanish. I will not be written out." Her voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of her husband's words and her own unyielding spirit. She turned and walked toward the staircase, each step firm, her resolve burning brighter than the ache in her chest. The house seemed to hold its breath after Margaret climbed the stairs. Michael remained at the table, staring at his father's letter, as if the ink might rearrange itself into different words if he just waited long enough. His hands trembled slightly, the paper crinkling under his grip. Sophie stood rigid near the counter, her arms folded tight across her chest. She wore defiance like armor, but Margaret's words had struck deeper than she wanted to admit. Her reflection in the kitchen window showed a woman cornered, her expression brittle. The children shifted uneasily in their chairs. They were too young to understand all the layers, but they knew when something was broken. Their father's silence frightened them more than their grandmother's fiery tone or their mother's sharp words. Finally, Michael pushed back his chair, the scrape echoing through the stillness. "I need a moment," he muttered, his voice hoarse. He clutched the letter and walked outside, leaving Sophie standing in the wreckage of a morning that had unraveled beyond repair. She turned sharply to the children. "Finish your breakfast," she ordered, but her voice cracked, betraying her agitation. She followed Michael onto the porch where he leaned heavily against the railing, staring out at the garden his mother once tended with devotion. Sophie's tone softened, almost pleading. "Michael, you can't let her guilt you like this. She's twisting your father's words, making herself the victim." Michael shook his head slowly, his jaw tight. "You didn't know him the way I did. He wasn't a man of embellishment. If he wrote this, he meant it." He tapped the letter against his palm, his eyes clouded with memory, and he trusted Mom to keep it safe. That means something. Sophie stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. "It means she's using it now because she knows she's losing control. You saw what she did, storming in, accusing me, making the kids uncomfortable. That's not love, Michael. That's manipulation." But Michael didn't answer right away. His silence stretched, heavy as stone. Sophie's heart hammered with frustration. She had worked so carefully to carve out a life of order, to build routines and boundaries that kept the chaos of others at bay. And now, in one morning, Margaret had lit a fire under all of it. Upstairs, Margaret sat on the edge of the guest bed, listening to the muffled cadence of their voices below. She could almost hear the tug-of-war in Michael's tone. Her chest ached with both sorrow and pride. She had spoken her truth, and whether it drew them closer or forced her out for good, she would not regret it. Her fingers brushed over the satchel beside her, where another envelope rested. This one she had written herself, a letter she never intended to share, unless the day came when silence no longer protected her. She had poured into it everything she had never dared to say. The loneliness of being set aside, the anguish of watching her place in the family slip away, and the love that still tethered her, fierce and unshakable. She wondered if she would need to hand it to Michael before she left. Outside, Michael finally spoke. "You know what hurts me the most, Sophie? That she didn't make this up. She didn't forge it or invent some story. She's been carrying his words for years, waiting for me to be ready. And now that I read them, I can't ignore what they ask of me." Sophie's lips tightened. So you'll let her stay? After everything? You'll let her unravel our home? Michael's eyes lifted, weary but resolute. It's already unraveling. And maybe it's because I haven't been strong enough to face the truth. I've let you draw the lines. Keep the peace in ways that made sense at the time. But it cost something, Sophie. It cost her. His words struck like a hammer. Sophie recoiled, anger and fear colliding inside her. She had spent years convincing herself that pushing Margaret to the margins was necessary, that it was better for the children, better for Michael, better for herself. But now, with his father's letter pressed between his fingers, her certainty wavered. The door creaked open behind them. Margaret stood in the frame, her figure steady despite the storm she carried inside. I won't stay where I'm unwanted, she said quietly, but I will not leave without you knowing the truth of who I am and what I gave to this family. Michael turned to her, torn between the two women who shaped his life. Sophie bristled, ready to strike back, but something in Margaret's eyes silenced her. Margaret stepped onto the porch, the morning air cool against her skin. She looked at her son, not pleading, not demanding, simply waiting. For once, the weight of the choice belonged to him, and him alone. The porch felt like a stage where every breath carried weight, where silence thundered louder than words. Michael stood between his wife and his mother, each woman radiating a different kind of force, one sharp and unyielding, the other steady and aching. His hands gripped the letter as if it were both a weapon and a lifeline. Margaret's voice came low but unwavering. Michael, I have never asked for more than a place in your life. I raised you with everything I had. Your father and I dreamed you would carry both of us forward. That's why he wrote these words. Not for me, not against Sophie, for you, to remind you of who you are and where you come from. Sophie's jaw tightened, her tone cutting like glass. And where does that leave us? Your family now? Do we just bow to every demand she makes? This house runs because I protect it. I keep order. I make sure the kids are safe. And every time she steps in, chaos follows. Michael, don't you see? She's tearing us apart. Michael's chest rose and fell, his breath ragged. He stared at the garden below where wild roses had grown through the fence his mother once mended by hand. Memory flashed, her bent figure pruning, guiding his small hands on the shears, teaching him patience in the soil. He had buried those moments beneath years of compromise, but now they clawed to the surface. He turned toward Sophie. His voice was rough but honest. You've kept this home together, I won't deny that. But somewhere along the way, we stopped making room for her. For the woman who gave me life, who buried her husband with nothing left but faith in me. If I turn away from her now, what kind of man does that make me? Sophie flinched as if struck. Her defenses faltered for an instant, but pride rushed in to shield her. It makes you a man who protects his wife, his children. That's your duty now, not to the past, not to some memory wrapped in guilt. Margaret stepped closer, her eyes glistening, yet resolute. I'm not your enemy, Sophie. I never wanted to take him from you. I only wanted to share what was already mine, a bond no marriage vow can erase. I may be old, I may be flawed, but I am still his mother. That truth cannot be canceled, no matter how much space you try to carve me out of. The words lingered in the air, sharp and tender all at once. Michael pressed the letter to his chest, as though bracing himself against the collision of their truths. His heart thundered with the weight of a decision that felt less like choosing and more like tearing himself in two. The children's laughter drifted faintly from inside, a fragile reminder of what was at stake. Michael closed his eyes, hearing echoes of his father's steady baritone. Take care of your mother, son. She will need you when I am gone. When he opened them, Sophie's eye burned into his, pleading, furious, terrified all at once. Margaret's gaze, in contrast, carried no demand. Only endurance, the patience of a woman who had waited her whole life for her child to see her clearly. Michael finally spoke, his voice low but firm. I can't erase her. I won't. She is a part of me as much as you are, Sophie. And if this home cannot hold both of you, then maybe the fault is mine for letting walls grow instead of bridges. Sophie's breath caught. Tears stung her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. She had fought so hard to be enough, to guard the life they had built, and now it felt as though the ground beneath her was crumbling. So what now, Michael? Do I just surrender everything I've built? Do I live under her shadow until there's nothing left of me? Margaret reached into her satchel, her hand steady. She drew out the second envelope, the one she had written in secret, and held it out. This isn't a demand, it's my truth. Read it when you're ready, not to wound, not to judge, but so you'll know me beyond what others say. Michael stared at the letter, the air thick with unspoken history. Sophie turned away, her shoulders trembling, caught between anger and despair. Margaret stood with quiet dignity, prepared for whatever choice her son would make. The moment stretched, fragile as glass. One decision could splinter everything, or, if handled with grace, begin to mend what years of silence had broken. Michael's hand hovered between the two women, torn yet resolute, as if at last he understood that no path forward would leave them untouched. The night was heavy, the air thick with the kind of silence that made every sound sharp, every heartbeat loud. Inside the house, the children slept, unaware of the storm unraveling outside their door. On the porch, Michael stood between the two women who defined the edges of his existence, his wife and his mother, while the weight of a single choice pressed down on him. Sophie's eyes glimmered in the half-light, hard and unyielding. Her voice, though trembling at its edges, struck with finality. If you bring her into this house, Michael, then you lose me. I will not live in her shadow. I will not raise our children in a home where I am treated as second. The words hit like stone against glass, sharp, irreversible. She was not bluffing. Every syllable carried the force of a woman pushed beyond her last boundary. Margaret did not flinch. She stood quietly, her figure small but her presence unwavering. The letter she had written for her son trembled in her hand, though her voice did not. I am not here to take what's yours, Sophie. I am here because I am his mother. I have nowhere else to go. My years are few now. I only want to spend what remains with the child I carried, the child I raised. Is that so unforgivable? Michael's breath caught in his throat. He had thought love was about weaving lives together, binding strands into something stronger. But now it felt like a tearing, each bond pulling him toward opposite ends, demanding sacrifice. His father's words still echoed in his mind. Ethan, take care of your mother. She will need you. Yet the vows he had spoken to Sophie echoed just as fiercely. For better or worse, until death do us part. His hands shook as he unfolded Margaret's second letter. The handwriting was delicate, fragile strokes etched with trembling persistence. My son, it began, I know the burden you carry, and I fear I have placed it too heavily on your shoulders. I have lived my life, made my mistakes, and perhaps my greatest was not preparing you for this day. I do not want to be the reason your family breaks. If Sophie cannot bear my presence, then I will go. I will find another way to endure. But know this, my love for you is not a chain meant to bind, but a thread meant to remind you of who you are. Whatever choice you make, I will carry it with me without bitterness. Be the man your father believed in. Be the husband your wife needs. Be whole, even if it means apart from me. The letter blurred as tears burned Michael's eyes. His mother had just released him from the very duty his father's voice had branded onto his soul. She had offered to step into loneliness so he could preserve his home. He lowered the paper, his gaze shifting between Sophie and Margaret. The moment stretched until it seemed the night itself leaned in, waiting. Finally he spoke, his voice rough but steady. I can't lose either of you, but I know I already have, in different ways. Mom, you gave me life. You gave me everything. Sophie, you gave me love, a home, children who carry my blood forward. To choose one is to betray the other, and yet I cannot stand frozen forever. Sophie's lips parted, her chest rising sharply. Then choose. Tonight. Michael's body trembled with the force of decision. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, his voice carried the weight of a man breaking himself in two. Sophie, I cannot abandon her. She has nowhere else. If that means you leave, I will not stop you. But I cannot let my mother end her days alone. The words shattered the air like thunder. Sophie staggered back as though struck, her face pale, her hands trembling. Fury flared in her eyes, but beneath it, grief spread like a wound too deep to hide. Then you've chosen her, she whispered, her voice breaking. Don't ask me to stay and watch myself disappear. She turned, her footsteps sharp against the porch, each one an unraveling thread of the life they had built together. Margaret reached out, her face etched with anguish. Sophie, please. But the door slammed before the plea could land. Michael stood frozen, his body hollow, his heart fractured by the echo of departure. He had clung to Judy, to blood, to the memory of his father's words. Yet in that choice he felt both triumph and devastation. The salvation of one bond at the cost of another. Margaret laid a trembling hand on his arm, her voice barely more than breath. My son, what have we done? The night offered no answer, only silence, vast and unyielding. And in that silence, Michael knew that some choices could never be undone, only carried, like scars, like ghosts, like the weight of love itself.